WCLN 1170 Radio and Cable Channel 16 are pleased to present We Should Know, hosted by J.W. Simmons, an upbeat, informative look at people, places, and issues facing our community. This education-based analysis of issues will remain positive and informative as we consider closely what we should know.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We Should Know's on there. I want to thank you for being with us today. Remind you that you can reach us with just simply sending an email to weshouldknowedu@gmail.com. Each and every week we come to you on Star Communications, Channel 16. We also come to you from WCLN Radio. There's a summation of this show in the Sampson weekly newspaper each and every week. We're talking about history this week, and we're talking with someone that knows a bit about that. Chris Woodson is the director of the Sampson County History Museum. He's worked in Raleigh with the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources and the museum, Cape Fear Historical Complex in Fayetteville. He's also worked on the Outer Banks region of the state. The Wilmington native earned his history degree from Lees McGray College in Banner Elk. Chris, thank you for being with us. And when I saw the word Banner Elk, it struck me as I was trying to read that. That's in the mountains. Right. You've had experience on the coast. You've kind of traversed the entire state of North Carolina, and you've got a keen eye to look at things from the lens of a historian. I think that's pretty important today. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to kind of start in somewhat of a broader question. Given the environment that we're in today, given everything that's going on and the impact with coronavirus, with the social unrest that's occurring, what do you see and how do you sensitize that as a historian? What might you see looking back at history that we might not see? Tell us what you see from the lens of looking at history.
I think one of the things, particularly with the pandemic, looking at it from a historical standpoint, is we do have some point of reference with the 1918 Spanish flu, similar type situation, global impact. So even though we're dealing with something, they use the term novel virus, which means it's a new virus, but the fallout from it is still not that different from some of the other situations we faced. So we do have some historical events that we can look back at and kind of gauge our response to what's going on now.
When we look at it, how do you think today, obviously versus 1918, there's a lot of differences in the gadgets, the tools we have, the communication devices and that kind of thing. The difference for the individual to be able to process it, was it as overwhelming, do you think, for an individual in 1918, or is it about the same as it is today, or is it more overwhelming today?
That's one of those, it's really hard to say. Obviously in 1919, they didn't have television or the internet, so there wasn't so much of that in-your-face saturation, but on the flip side of that is nowadays we have a lot of medical advances. We have access to more expertise, more experience to deal with some of what's going on. So it's kind of a trade-off. I guess you could say there's pluses and minuses to both situations, but I think we're definitely more saturated with it. I know, like every day, go on Facebook and I can look up the Sampson Weekly, see what the latest count is, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It's just constantly in our faces, whereas in 1918, it was probably more or less limited to whatever your individual community was experiencing.
I think one of the things we talked about off air was the interesting part of the history of mankind. There's been this almost continual process of upheavals, of some pretty horrific things that have gone on throughout the history of mankind from centuries ago. When you look at what's happening now societally and things that's going on, we consider ourselves somewhat educated and look at ourselves, I guess, as pretty much far up the food chain. But sometimes our human behavior exhibits other kinds of frustrations, and we act it out pretty much in some similar ways, do we not?
Yeah, it's one of those, the old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, we have made great leaps, with progress, with technology, medicine, things like that, but, at the core of it, we're still just human beings that respond in certain ways to certain provocations or certain events. We've changed a lot, but we haven't.
We've often heard, and I guess to some degree, many folks maybe in high school started looking at history, but there is this kind of visceral response that human beings has, and without getting into psychology or social psychology, history reflects some pretty visceral responses to things throughout history. How do you see history as a historian being a positive contribution now? Should looking at history and looking back at history be important for us to do to recognize where we are now? Someone said the other day that you have to look back before you can move forward. And I've kind of wrestled with that statement.
Yeah, I've recently made a comment to a friend. History is a real mixed bag. You have to keep the past in mind, but you don't want to get too bogged down in it, or you do have a difficulty moving forward. So it's a real balancing act. You're walking a fine line between the past and what's going on now and how it's going to impact the future.
There's a lot of conversation now that builds around expectation, and again, that looking forward piece. What do we expect? What should we expect going forward? What should we change to relate ourselves more to what we should be in the future? From a historian's point of view, when you look at it, what advice might you have as we try to figure that out? Can history be a playbook for us to look at and say, well, this didn't work 100 years ago, why should we think it'll work now? Or this did work 100 or 200 years ago, should we try to retool that and make it work today?
Yeah, you used a good phrase there, retool. We can look to the past for answers on how to deal with things in the present and how to move forward, but we have to keep in mind that not all of the circumstances are the same, so it does require some retool. And just trying to think of a good parallel, but anything that you've done in the past, like if your car breaks down, in the past it was because your battery was low or whatever, so in the future, keep a lookout for that, but it may not be the battery next time, it may be the brakes, and that's the way it is with history. Just because it's happened in the past doesn't mean the way we respond to it's going to require the same response in the present or the future. So it's a very fluid thing, and you do have to keep an eye on the past, but be willing to retool. And
one of the things I've heard recently in conversations, and of course now there's conversations about everything, and as you said, it's both immediate and in your face, and some of it requires thought, some of it doesn't get a whole lot of thought, but there was a phrase that was mentioned, and I've heard this many times in looking at history, and we often look at history so we don't repeat some of the same things that we've done in the past, so we don't do over some of the bad things that has occurred in the past. It's been devastating. However, when you look back as a historian, do we continue to do some of the same things? I mean, if we think about wars and those kinds of things, we continue to do those. I mean, history reflects regularity of conflicts and wars and battles. I think you could go back 12th century and even before. It's constantly going on. How do we learn from history, Chris?
That's the age-old question. I think the conflict, the wars, it probably goes back to the first time one caveman wanted another caveman's cave. I mean, I don't know if it's human nature or what, but that's the $20,000 question right there. How do you learn from it, and do we learn from it? And I'm not when you look at it, it doesn't look like we've learned a whole lot at times. We do keep making a lot of the same mistakes over and over. So.
In today's world, you obviously are the director of the museum, the Sampson County Museum here in this area, and got experience in the past. Do you see people more interested in history now, or more interested in just the immediacy of the moment?
I think it varies with age groups. I think older folks, as you get older, you start reflecting on your upbringing and your past, and you start to feel a little more connected with the history world. And I think younger people are more in the moment, and that's probably not true across the board for any of it. But I think just the trends we see with people that are interested in the museums. And that's part of our job as a museum, to make it more relevant for younger people, so they don't miss out on it until they're retired or whatever, and then reflecting back on the past to make it relevant for them now. So hopefully they can develop that appreciation and make those connections to the present and the more immediate history.
Well, and I'm sure it's hard for you, because obviously you are an enthusiast when it comes to history and looking at history and trying to describe history. Is the immediacy of action what oftentimes is hard to get people that maybe are younger to get involved? They don't feel or sense the immediacy of it. They see it as something that is a dead issue and gone away.
I think, that's a good point as far as history, the way a lot of, particularly younger people, you're talking about dead people hundreds of years ago. It's just, sometimes it's hard to make that connection. Why is that important to me? I'm a 20-year-old college student. Why should I care, what happened in Europe 400 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of, so, and that part of our job as historians and museums and historic sites is making those, connecting those dots, making it relevant.
We're going to take a break. We'll be back in a moment. Stay tuned.
Experiencing slow internet? If you have a fast internet package, the problem is most likely your wireless router. With more devices using Wi-Fi, your wireless router may not be able to deliver the speed and coverage you need. We now have the leading solution to enhance your internet experience. Using small devices in a mesh network, these Wi-Fi appliances cover just about any size home, so that all your devices can operate to their fullest potential. Whole home Wi-Fi from Star Communications. Get the most out of your internet connection.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Thanks for being with us. We went to a quick break a while ago. We're coming up on our second segment here. We're talking with Chris Woodson, the director of the Sampson County Museum, held positions throughout the state in different areas related to history, related to things that you might have heard about, you might have read in high school. Chris, I want to thank you for being with us today. On this segment, I want to kind of open up with this question, and we've talked a little bit about different things in the first segment of the show, but I want to try to focus on that idea of why should we care about history. Folks listening to this show, watching us today, may think, well, I want to do something else. I want something more intriguing. I want something that excites me more. But for folks like you and others that I talk to frequently, if you look at history, it's pretty exciting. It's a pretty exciting area. So help us understand why, especially today, why should we care about history in a constructive way? I mean, we've got different opinions about destroying certain artifacts and keeping certain artifacts and that kind of thing. But talk to us from just why should we even care about history at all?
I think the main reason is that history is our story. It's about where we've come from, it's about where we are now, and it's about where we're headed as a society or as a country or even as a county or a community. So sometimes it's hard to see the relevance of it when you're just getting through your day-to-day life, but it is all connected. There's the things that are going on right now, for instance, with the social unrest, there's a direct line you can draw from that to events 150 years ago. And there's another line you can draw, a little bit hazier line, but to where what things are going to look like in the future. So it is sometimes hard to see the connection And that's one of the challenges we face as historians in museums or historic sites and that kind of thing, is to make it relevant. We have a saying when I worked for state historic sites, kind of a mantra when presenting things or doing programs or artifacts, is depth, relevancy, and authenticity. It's not enough just to put the information out there. You have to give it some depth, and you have to give it some relevance. Why is it important to Sampson County, or why is it important to North Carolina? And authenticity, is this really, in fact, a legitimate historical artifact or a legitimate historical question? So there are guidelines we have in place like that when we're interpreting history, and that's all part of the challenge of making it relevant.
Considering those things you just talked about, how important is it to make sure we have accuracy in not only knowing history, but understanding history? Accuracy meaning what really did happen. Was it how we perceive it? Was it actually that? No matter what the historical moment may be, whether it was the Revolutionary War, whether it's, as you indicated, the Civil War and all those things that went on, we all have seen pictures of the horrific kinds of things that occurred, and this country's resilience has to some way be built around the importance of making sure that we understand history from an accurate point of view. Talk to us a bit about that. I think that's so critical, especially for me, because sometimes I'll look at a history book and I go, well, how do I know everything in that book just because it's a book is right?
Right. Yeah, accuracy is paramount. I mean, it's when you're whether you're reporting the news or whether you're writing an article or whether you're interpreting history, as historians, we strive to interpret history as accurately as possible and present all the different viewpoints as accurately as possible, because if you're not, then people aren't getting the complete picture. I know you have a background in police work. Mm-hmm. You can ask 5 different people what happened at the scene of a car accident. You'll get 5 different stories, mm-hmm. and it's the same way with historical events. We've got reports of Civil War battles, for instance. Depending on who you ask and where they were and what they were doing at the time of the battle, they might have 5 different versions of that battle. So what we're doing as historians and as historical history institutions is trying to parse through all that information and get as complete a picture as possible.
I think one of the things that I don't want to get too deep and lose our audience, but there is a point that we zero in and look for specifics about history to validate history. And one of the things that struck me a while ago in the commentary you made was about artifacts. How important is artifacts to validating and verifying the accuracy of history?
They play a crucial role in that. They give us little snapshots of what a particular era was like, depending on what the type of artifact it is. They're pieces of the larger puzzle. We've got photographs, we've got artifacts, we've got written word, and you're putting all that information together, sort of like a composite, to come up with the bigger picture of what was going on at a particular time. And artifacts can be misleading as well too. You can say you're out digging at a site somewhere, like an archaeology site, and you find a coin that has the date 1785 on it. But you can't say that this site dates back to 1785. It could have been from 1847, but someone dropped a coin there, from 18. It's like piecing together clues to paint a bigger picture.
So even artifacts have to be validated.
Yeah, exactly. Just because something's old doesn't mean it's relevant. It doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily tell you all you need to know.
Something that growing up in this area of the state, as a child and as a young boy, I found quite a few of, and I think this fits in because I've seen them at the museum, is arrowheads that were Native Americans had and so forth. That would be considered an artifact. Particularly in the Johnson County area, in the Bentonville area, artifacts as it relates to something called mini balls and various kinds of metal objects used in the Civil War and those kinds of things. Are those kinds of artifacts something that that you look for to use in the museum? Is that something that helps you in painting a true picture of what our history is?
It can be of help. It's they are artifacts that reflect certain events that were going on in a certain period of time. And interesting thing, we do have the arrowheads and spear points and things at the museum. This is something that I didn't learn until later in life, but a lot of those things date back thousands of years. You know, you see arrowhead, you think, oh, the old John Wayne cowboy movies. Right. But no, these are, prehistory. So they were, they tell us, that thousands and thousands of years ago, there were people here in Sampson County. We don't know much about them, but we have evidence that they were here through these artifacts. And
to kind of put that in perspective, that was before people that were not originally on this continent came to this continent.
Right, well before, what they call, I guess, pre-Columbian times, before the days of the New World exploration.
One of the things I'm hoping that today in our conversation that folks may be listening to this and maybe it will help them reflect a little bit and put some structure around, to some degree, all the chaos that's going on. And by doing that and looking at everything from artifacts to who we are, to how we got here, to that whole structure, does that help us better have a positive mindset of where we are in history? Or does it create more chaos?
I think that, like I said before, I think that can be a mixed bag. Ideally, we try to take the positives from it or take the good from history and use it to build a better now and moving forward to a better future, but sometimes it does contribute to the chaos and the conflict because, again, just like with anything else with history, you've got different people coming at it from different viewpoints and different perspectives, different countries. It can be such a mixed bag like that. And a lot of people are looking at how they interpret history as a way to validate their worldview rather than to take it as a composite and look towards the bigger picture.
Has history been overlooked as part of our structure? We focus heavily on science, technology, engineering, and math. Has history been overlooked as a key fundamental piece of how we educate ourselves?
I think so. I think there's some argument to be made for that, as we've, I know just throughout my lifetime being a product of schooling throughout the 70s and early 80s, we started moving more and more into math and science to try to be more competitive with like Asia and Europe in the technology fields. And you've got only so many hours in a school day and so many months of a school year, so you got to eliminate things. And I think some of what we would have traditionally called the classical studies or the liberal arts type studies have taken a back seat to the math and sciences. And in the old days, 1700s, 1800s, when somebody went to college, they were taught the classics, literature, art, science, history, music. Now we're very focused on technology, but a lot of that's just because that's the way the world has evolved.
I think one of the things I'd like to kind of follow up is continue this discussion after break, but I want us, if we can, to kind of pick you to help us, I guess, get a better picture of how this foundation of our history has interpreted to some degree who we are, or maybe who we are not today. So as we go to break, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for being with us. We're coming up on our second break. We're basically halfway the show. I'd like for you to call a friend, stay tuned. Also, I would like to hear from you about this show, any other show that we've done. Coming August, we'll be going into 10 years for the We Should Know show. Time does go by fast, and I thought about that as we're talking about history here. Call a friend, stay tuned, and you can text us or email us. Actually, email us at weshouldknowedu@gmail.com. We'll be back in just a moment and talking with Chris Woodson.
You come out to replace a bad sensor, and that adds a 5-year commitment to my contract, and you don't tell me? Here's your sign.
Switch to the sign that's keeping homes secure and customers happy all over the area. Security from Star Communications. We pride ourselves on fair pricing and quick, friendly service every time.
Somebody trying to break into this place?
Security from Star Communications.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thanks for being with us today. Name of the show is We Should Know. I'm J.W. Simmons. I'm talking with Chris Woodson, who's the director of the local museum here, the Sampson County History Museum. Chris, one of the things I wanted to kind of follow up on this segment is talking a bit about history, and in the sense of the near history, which could be last week, could have been yesterday, but the near history versus the history maybe a decade, century ago. How important is it for us to look at history and question it from kind of a science point of view, to not do the same thing over again? Oftentimes I've heard people say, well, we did that a year ago, or 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago, and here's some of the dangers, or here's some of the things you don't want to do. Example would be with fireworks, where somebody would hold a fireworks item in their hand and would blow their finger off. Well, you don't want to do that anymore.
Right.
Is history more complex to understand, obviously, than my crude example, but is history more complex to understand, and should we strive to understand it?
Yeah, we should definitely strive to understand it. Unfortunately, we do keep blowing our fingers off with the firecracker. Yeah. But that was a great example. There's a lot of it has gotten more complex. You use the word, the complexity of it, and understanding. One thing you have to keep in mind is, with every passing year, every passing decade, you're adding new layers of history. So and that might sound like stating the obvious, but people don't really consider that. Like, I hear a lot of times at the museum, people say, well, they just don't teach history anymore like they used to. So, well, somebody that grew up in the 1960s, there's 50 years of history that's happened since then that's been added to the mix. So it does get more and more complex as it goes along, just if nothing else, because you're steadily adding layers to it. When you and I were in school, there was no September 11th. There was no, or the Vietnam, in my case, the Vietnam War was just starting. Mm-hmm. So there's whole layers of history that add to the mix and make it much more difficult to sift through it.
Those moments in time, as we look at it, and we're talking a little bit about our history now. I recall, quite frankly, my grandparents, which we're talking quite a few years ago, but there was things that I recall them saying to me, and even my parents, as I am now where I am now in this journey, I look back and think to myself, that was really critically important. So is it the fact that we maybe hadn't reached the level of experience that we recognize the importance of it? Is it too late? What and when and at what point in time does history become critical for our survival? Because clearly, if we keep doing the same bad things over and over again, eventually it will result in our demise. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I think a lot of it goes to that it's such a complex thing, and it's such an abstract thing to, on a day-to-day basis, we go through our lives, we go to work, we interact with our friends, coworkers, we just do our thing on a day-to-day basis. History is such an abstract part of that, like when I go to the grocery store to pick up some things on the way home from work, I'm not thinking about what did people in the 1700s do for groceries. Right. It's not a part of our day-to-day lives. And for a lot of people, it never gets beyond the classroom experience as a child. There's people that follow history through our lives that are very passionate about it, but I think a lot of people, it's just not something we think about, how it impacts our day-to-day lives.
The other part of history I want you to, if you will, speak to as well. Oftentimes we look at history and and we have a tendency, or actually maybe we do, we demonize certain places in history that we didn't like. And it could be, again, near history, or it could be far history. Is history something to be that we should demonize, or should we maybe take a highlighter and highlight it and say, I'm learning this, and list the things we're learning from that, rather than just pushing it out of our mind? I mean, you were in the war in the Middle East. You've got things there I'm sure you don't want to think about again, as many people did in war, but it's part of the history, and it helped kind of trademark to some degree the place we are now for everybody. There's probably people don't realize that they maybe never went to the war in the Middle East, but in some way it impacted their life. They probably can't figure it out, but because I'm one of these people that believes that everything matters. I think everything's kind of a domino effect. In some way or the other, it's affecting something else. That piece of the discussion, is that something important for us to try to realize, that all of these pieces, you can't hide it and dismiss it. You have to say, yeah, that did happen, and make sure that we improve upon ourselves. I don't know, maybe I'm getting too deep here. I hope I'm not losing folks, but I know you understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that is critical to understanding it, or is recognizing those connections. That you mentioned the domino effect, that where we are today isn't just a random event. It didn't just happen out of thin air. There's a whole sequence of events going back, in some ways, to the birth of this nation that have led to where we are now. Just you mentioned my experience in the Middle East. There's a whole history there going. You could go back as far as you want, but like say at the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was carved up into some of these modern Middle Eastern countries, and ever since then, because of that one thing, you've had this domino effect that's led us up to the current conflicts in the Middle East. That's just one example, and you can go down so many rabbit holes with that. It is. It's
like threads.
We would start losing people after a while.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you can get so buried in it, but there's so many layers to history.
Well, and an example would be, I could probably ask the question to our audience, to you, where were you at approximately 6:30 p.m. on January 16, 1991? I suspect Chris Woodson may be able to remember that vividly because you were not only involved with the museum, but you served in the 142nd Field Artillery Brigade of the Arkansas National Guard. And you ended up with that battery attached to the United States Army's 7th Corps and fired hundreds of 8-inch shells to support the Britain troop, the 7th Armored Desert Rats Division. You, I'm sure, remember all that. It's quantified in history. But to just throw it out at anybody else, they're not going to remember it. So how do we get folks from your position as a curator or director of the museum, as people that are interested in history, to understand each and every one of these things are critical?
There's not really one good answer. It's just part of the ongoing job of museums and teachers. And that's why it is important that we don't lose history in the mix in our classroom experience. We don't. It might not get you the high-paying jobs like the technology degrees, but it's still relevant to what we're experiencing. You don't want to lose touch with that side of the academic world. It's part of being a well-rounded people to help us understand how we got to where we are.
We've been taught recently, because of the pandemic, to wear face masks, to stay 6 feet apart, to wash our hands regularly and be sanitized and those kinds of things. As part of that, should we maybe also look at something else we could do, which would be to kind of slow down a little bit and reflect on our historical perspective and kind of bathe ourselves in understanding not only where we're at, but how we got here. And I think about the museum has one building there dedicated to the military, but to kind of be somewhat appreciative of those people that have done a lot of things that keep us surviving as a country.
Yeah, that's our newest building there at the museum, and that's where we wanted to go with that museum when we first initiated that project, was not just to have a building full of stuff, a bunch of artifacts. We wanted to tell the stories behind them. You know, we wanted to connect those artifacts and those uniforms and flags and things with people. You know, there's real people behind all this stuff. It's not just, you know, like the arrowheads you mentioned.
Yeah.
they're not just pieces of stone. There was
But
somebody,
a human being held
that made that stone, and they hunted with it, or whatever the story. Yeah. That's what we try to do with our new military building, is not just glorify, you know, battle and the military experience, but to let people know that, hey, these were real folks that, you know, did go off and sacrifice, and some of them, you know, the ultimate sacrifice. And so I think that's what separates artifacts from antiques. You know, the artifacts have a story behind them, you know, the relevance, that depth.
We're going to go to break in just about a minute. I think we're about 60 seconds out. But when we come back, I want to kind of talk, this last segment, I want to kind of talk about the museum, some of the newer exhibits you got down there. And you were just talking about the military museum. That's critically important. There's a number of other exhibits that a lot of folks may not be aware of. During all of these kinds of things that's been going on this year with the pandemic and now, of course, a lot of social unrest going on, we tend to forget that that is a very telling story within itself. In the confines of that rather large area down there, there's multiple locations of true specific history with quantitative data to back it up. And you're there to help kind of weave people through that process of understanding it. As folks look for things to do, they may have a good day if they give you a call and just chat with you and talk to you about the importance of that museum. So as we go to break and we come back, I'm letting folks know we're going to cue you up to talk about specifically that museum.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back in a moment. We're talking with Chris Woodson, the director of the Sampson County History Museum. We'll be back in one moment.
To get the most out of your electronic devices, you need a strong internet connection and a protected home Wi-Fi network. You need high-speed internet from Star. Star has the fastest, most affordable high-speed internet service available for all your devices. We have no long-term contracts or high-pressure sales. Our service speaks for itself, and switching is hassle-free. We take care of everything with free installation from a local company. High-speed internet from Star. Internet at the speed of life.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We Should Know's on there. We're talking with Chris Woodson, the director of the museum right here, Sampson County Museum, Elizabeth Street in Clinton, North Carolina. A huge number of exhibits in that museum. We've talked a bit about history, the impact of history, how history has changed our lives, how oftentimes folks say we need to look back at history so we can look forward, Chris. There's a number of exhibits, I call them venues. Actually, they're buildings on the site right here in Clinton that go from everything from the main building that's got a lot of artifacts in it to a military building, to a blacksmith shop, Grange Agricultural Museum. All of these buildings make up a huge complex there. Even one, the Woodson store, which was up in the northern part of the county, that was transported here as an example of a store back in what, the 40s, 50s, and 60s in that era?
Yeah, I believe the approximate dates from the 1920s to the 1970s. So it was, you know, it was around for over 50 years. It's seen a lot of history during its time.
All of those are there. Zero in on some of those things I've just mentioned. And others that I might not have mentioned. I know Claude Moore had a number of buildings, and everybody knows that name, I think. If they don't, from Turkey, North Carolina, professor. His wife was Norma Moore, well-known historian in the county. You were able to, or someone was able to capture a cabin museum, I think, that he at one time was involved with. Right.
The cabin museum was located up at his property in Turkey, and in fact it's called Cabin Museum Road still. Mm-hmm. And David King, when David and Jeannie were directors running the museum, at some point I believe when Claude passed away, the family, it was bestowed to the, or bequeathed, whatever the word, left to the museum, as well as the Holmes House, which is a small Civil War era frame house. So yeah, he was the keeper of Sampson County and Duplin County history for many, many years. Real treasure as far as the historical preservation in this area.
And those particular buildings, the artifacts that relate in those buildings show a period of time and expose a period of time that creates to this day a lot of anxiety and disturbance. And to some degree, we want to just turn that channel off. Is it effective to just disengage that part of history so our children and grandchildren just don't know anything about it?
No, I don't think we can turn it off completely. We can choose to ignore it if we want, but it kind of at our peril, again, like we talked about earlier with failure to see how events from the past connect with the events of the future. And it is, maybe it's human nature. You just want to, close your eyes and put your hands over your ears and ignore the bad parts of history, but it's all there and it's all part of the bigger picture.
I want to kind of talk a bit about what you're doing at the museum now. Clearly, there's should I say, not an open door at the museum with the pandemic going on. Do you see in the near future those doors being opened again? And if not, what are the alternatives for you to help keep the museum in the forefront for folks to think about as a resource, and how do they access that resource?
Right. We are hoping, we're still kind of playing it by ear, as are most of us. We are hoping to open up sometime in July, coming up in a few weeks, if we feel safe about it, but it will be a different kind of museum experience. We won't, again, like so many other things, we're just not going to be able to do business the way we used to, but we are going to be open soon.
So do you see when that happens, if it's July or when, I think everybody's following the numbers, if it's July or whenever it happens, do you see that being face mask, distancing numbers of people you'll be able to have in? For example, if somebody says, well, look, I've got 60 people, can we all meet there at 10 o'clock? Probably not a good idea.
Yeah, that's going to be one of the main things, is we're going to have to be vigilant about limiting the groups. We're not going to be able to do things for a while, I'm assuming anyway. We're not going to be able to do things like school tours, or we've got our larger programs that we've already canceled for the duration of the year. But then on the flip side, we have a small group, a family of 5 or 6 people, that I don't foresee that being much of a problem, but we are going to have precautions in place. We're going to have, it almost sounds like a cliche now, but we're going to have sanitizer stations throughout the museum. We'll have masks and gloves if people want them, like disposable masks and gloves. If people feel comfortable with that, they're welcome to it. We want to do everything we can to keep the experience viable, but still keep it safe and respectful of different people's health considerations and things like that.
A lot of museums now have already developed virtual tours and those kinds of things. Is that something that you're looking at doing as well? And do you see that being a way of putting the museum in front of people? Because we're in a world now, you don't want to have to go anywhere or do anything. You just want to push a button and it comes to your door. Is that a way of allowing them to do that without getting out of their easy chair?
Yeah, that's definitely become a very viable option with all this, and it's even something we've been doing. Starting early on in the shutdown, I was making little 2-3 minute long videos, of different, go out in the military building and walk around for about 3 minutes and talk about it, and then post it on Facebook. Mm-hmm. So it's been, in some ways, it's been fun to watch friends at other museums, colleagues, former coworkers. We're all wading through this same mud, trying to figure out ways to keep the museums out there, because we are such a people-oriented business. And once you take the people out, we just have to start thinking outside the box. We've upping our game, so to speak, as far as social media with videos and activities for school children. just trying to be part of the solution.
The museum offers not only all these cabins, but it offers a lot of content of information, dates, times, people, location, names, I mean, validated information. As you're trying to introduce people to the venue, given everything that we've seen going on over the years, and particularly now with social unrest, how important is it that you make sure that the information that you have there, the things that they're looking at, that they're explained with accuracy and with understanding?
Well, that's very important. We want to be as accurate as possible. We don't want to ever be construed as approaching things with a certain agenda of this or that. Mm-hmm. Our job as museums, our job as historians is just to put the information out there and interpret it and let people take from it what they will. It's, history is very complex, and we live in a world where sound bites and memes and, like instant history, but every historical event, there's so many layers of it. So the best we can do, and what we strive to do, is put the information out there, present it to folks, and sort of give them a starting point, you might say.
Part of history, again, we've talked about this a little bit earlier, but part of history is often betrayed and maybe misinterpreted. There's a need for folks to understand, how do we develop, especially with social media, a way to desensitize some things and become accurate, adaptable, and understanding. And I guess it's fine if folks want to dismiss things, but that's individual. But the accuracy, how do we determine accuracy today? In today's world, with all the information we have, it's been said many times, we're in information overload. And oftentimes it's much easier to just kind of check that block and say, okay, I got this source from whatever. But if the source is not accurate, if the information is not accurate, sometimes I talk to people and I look at them and go, what channel have you been listening to? Because it reflects what their opinion is. Yeah,
that's a great point. We live in a world too, where if people don't like something, they simply say it's fake.
Yeah.
Information and the internet is kind of a blessing and a curse. We got all this information in front of us, but we don't know what of it's accurate and what of it's not. So it's just incumbent on all of us to, whether we're reading a news article or reading something of historical nature, it's just incumbent on all of us to follow up on that with our own research and our own, you read a story about something that happened in the Civil War. Well, did it happen or did it not? So you check another source, and then another, you kind of like detective work. You're piecing together information to come out with the true picture. And we again, with the internet age, we do have so much information at our disposal. We can do that detective work and piece together an accurate picture for the most part.
So would you say validation equals appreciation?
Yeah.
Because if you don't really accept it or understand it, it's hard to appreciate.
Right. I mean,
how it's shaped.
I think it does give you a greater appreciation once you can validate that. Once you can say, yes, this is true. And, we live in an age where fake news, conspiracies, whatnot. Sometimes it just really is what it is. It may, whatever that historical event or whatever that social unrest, sometimes you just have to take it at face value. There's not any grand conspiracy.
Absolutely. So if somebody wants to get up with you, Chris, how do they reach you?
You can reach us at the museum. There Wednesday through Saturday from 10 to 4, and our number is 910-590-0007. Or you can go to Google us, find us on Facebook and our website. Also, we've even gone to Instagram now. So
send you an email.
Right.
Thank you for being with us and kind of enlightening us, and we encourage folks to go to the museum, give you a call, check on the time. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. We look forward to seeing you again next week. And as we go to break, we always say and like to encourage you to, number one, stay safe, Stay well, and by all means, may God bless.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of We Should Know with host J.W. Simmons. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion regarding this or any episode, please send your emails to weshouldknowedu@gmail.com. And remember to tune in every Tuesday at 2:30 for another informative episode of We Should Know.